really tiny, but scary smart. Celina?
Thank you, Susie, and thank you to TEDx San Francisco for inviting me to come out here and, more importantly, share with you some of the visions and, more importantly, impressions of what I think in terms of risk management. If we think about, I call it the 3 R's. Since I speak and teach a lot of military officers who don't have a lot of time and don't have a lot of patience for academia, you have to get it into 3 little initials. So I call it the 3 R's, responding to risk with resourcefulness. So if you think about the times that we live in, they're really extraordinary and remarkable, but they're also, in terms of how you think about things, the unthinkable can happen. And the last several decades, we've been actually beneficiaries and reaped the rewards of globalization, getting products, services, information cheaper, better, and faster. But more recently, we've seen the dark side of globalization as well. Just take September 11th. On that fateful day, you actually had 19 terrorists who took advantage of our freedoms here in the United States and their access to global information, technology, and travel in order to shock and awe us, and more importantly, change the way that we live or travel or think of terrorism forever. And as someone who travels quite a bit, I really resent every time I've got to line up at all of those airports, take off my really cute Italian shoes, and more importantly, stuff all of those toiletries in that little Ziploc bag for everyone to see. So if you think about it, we actually, everywhere we look, we see global risks. Every time we turn on the TV and every time we think about what we're looking at, whatever the website is, we see manifestations of this global risk. Whether it's the armed conflicts we see in Afghanistan and Iraq, that's actually taken a lot of our blood and treasure, or the race for resources, whether it's food or clean water or energy. And if we think about today, for example, the financial markets, this roller coaster ride that all of us have been privy to or maybe victimized by the last couple of years. And sadly, we've seen, too, natural disaster wreak havoc and in terms of human losses in events such as the earthquakes in Haiti, in Chile, and I think some of us were actually stranded last week because of the volcanic ash. So if we think about all of these global risks, we have to think about how they affect us more importantly, every day, and what we should think about in terms of how to protect ourselves. And we are always constantly thinking about balancing this rewards and risk ratio. And if you think about it, every day we calculate risks. And we have to think about calculating those risks, whether it's in life or in love or in investment portfolios, and take those calculated risks. And how should we think about managing risk at these different levels? So I think about it in actually 3 ways. And we think about risk every day. I took a risk today, as someone knows who's in the audience. We took a taxi and we're careening down the very wet streets. And I was thinking to myself, good thing in the back seat today I put my seatbelt on. Because I couldn't avoid that risk. And there are 4 ways that we think about managing risk in our day-to-day lives. So the first one really is avoiding risk, the just don't go there option. The second one is reducing risk, which I did today by thankfully putting on my seatbelt. The third one is transferring risk, which is actually ensuring risk away. And the fourth one is actually accepting it. And I have a lot of friends who are very engaged in extreme sports who do this every day. And if you think about it too, we actually have to think and pretty much assess which ways you want to take a look at this grid and make decisions at every level and every action that you do. And the way I've actually looked at it, both from my own personal experience and those who I've actually counseled and worked with, is actually at these 3 separate levels. The personal or the individual level, the corporate or the professional level, and lastly at the national security level. So think about in your own life, in personal choices. I just shared with you my taxi ride experience, but remember last fall, several of us were debating, should we take that swine flu vaccine? Should I inoculate my children? Or more importantly, should I think about leaping into that new relationship or not? And if we also think about where we choose to live, I learned last night at a cocktail party that the earthquake, the big one, is supposed to come here in San Francisco. And we actually went through a tour this afternoon of the Fairmont Hotel that showed us kind of before and after the earthquake and the Great Fire of San Francisco. These are all choices that we all make at the individual level. And at the corporate level, We're filled here with TEDsters who are all entrepreneurs. You actually take risks every day thinking about how you want to run your business. Should I think about taking on more debt in order to expand my operations? Should we launch that product even though we haven't really gone through all the trials and tribulations to make sure it's going to be a hit? Should we enter a new market and, more importantly, take chances, figuring out will that investment actually work, or will that product or that service meet the local needs of that market? Then thirdly, we look at the national security area. So every day, our leaders at the most senior levels, like the president and the cabinet, to the most junior levels of military officers and law enforcement officials, think about and calculate how to manage risk every day to keep us and our communities and our nation basically safe from the harms that lurk outside and around us. I've actually been privileged to be working for the last 4 secretaries of state and have actually encountered risk at all 3 of these levels. Probably the most interesting assignment that I had was actually running the White House Situation Room, and it was during President Clinton's tenure. And we were actually 15 years ago today, or last week, the ones who informed him about the tragic Oklahoma City bombing. And the responsibilities that we were basically charged with was trying to figure out who was responsible for it. And I'll never forget that day because we were actually looking for basically an Arab terrorist, not someone in terms of homegrown. And it's so scary that now, fast forward 15 years, we're still grappling with the same threats of homegrown versus foreign terrorists here on our soil. In all of my travels, I think one of the things I've actually been able to appreciate is the value of life. And more importantly, it's how you think about, is it worth your life in order to risk things so you can actually make a difference and contribute? So some of you may wonder how I got into this world of counterterrorism, and it really had to do with September 11th. On that fateful day, I was at Goldman Sachs on a trading floor in London when we saw the first airplane hit the first tower, and the second one hit, and I actually blurted out, "Oh, it's got to be Osama bin Laden," to which a lot of my colleagues were like, "We knew you worked for the CIA and were just hanging out with us, pretending to bank international clients." And I knew I wanted to do something. As a native New Yorker, I took it very personally. And that occasion came about a couple weeks later when I was asked to come back to Washington and head up the team that would follow the money trail. And it's kind of interesting, a good marriage of my experience on Wall Street, more importantly, understanding how international financial markets worked. I actually joined what we called the financial front of the war on terror. In that role, I was able to travel to pretty dangerous parts of the world, responding to different terrorist attacks in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East. And it was really interesting is what you would think would be the regular risks at the personal level were the ones you didn't actually expect. So for example, yet again, I have this thing with cars. I drive pretty fast, usually want to be in control. It's usually either getting almost run over by a motorcade or being in a motorcade and running other people down. It's amazing how you really try to appreciate orderly flows of traffic that we are benefited from here in the United States. And then on another occasion, and this is actually what inspired me to learn yet another language, Arabic, was when I was in the Middle East and this very senior official, who's a central banker, turns to the interpreter saying, "Are you sure she's American? Are you sure she's authorized to actually negotiate on her country's behalf? Because she looks really young." And that actually inspired me. The next time I went to see him, I actually spoke enough Arabic to actually tell him that I understood, and I didn't, what he was saying at the time. And if I think about all the crazy places that I've been, little did I know that I would face more threats from the Washington bureaucracy than Al-Qaeda itself, because I had to do lots of battle with a lot of different, very alpha male, let's doers versus thinkers, or people who thought they were thinkers versus doers, and tried to actually lobby and, more importantly, get my agenda pushed forward. Because at the time, people didn't think about money as the oxygen to any activity, whether it be good or bad. And that's what we actually had seen, was actually following the money trail was the most effective way to, and if you think of money as oxygen, to actually suffocate terrorist groups. So if I think about the way that I spent the last couple of years in terms of endangering myself and the lives of my teammates, I really had to really hunker down and think about, is that risk really worth life and limb? I could answer that for myself, but I couldn't necessarily answer that for my friends and colleagues who had families who they'd be leaving behind. And in terms of all of our encounters and travels, I also had this very uncanny habit of staying at 5-star hotels that would subsequently be bombed in places like Amman, in Mumbai, in Jakarta. So those who invented TripIt are now really keen on following me as to where I'm going to be staying and what cities I'm going to. So those are the types of things where I think I've thought about myself, but also the greater good or those around me in terms of incurring risk. And if I think about the people who I've learned the most from, I've actually, for the last 3 years, been engaged in less lethal or less deadly activities, teaching what I used to be and preaching what I used to be practicing. And there are 3 great men who I've been able to work with and for who've really inspired me. And you may recognize them: General Colin Powell, David Petraeus, who's the head of our Central Command, and one who you may not know, who's the longest-serving Navy SEAL, is actually Admiral Eric Olson. All 3 of them have led men and women into battle, but more importantly, they've each faced life-threatening episodes themselves. You may not know that General Powell actually risked his life to save his colleagues from a burning helicopter, and that General Petraeus was actually accidentally shot in the chest during a training accident. And he was saved by actually Dr. Frist at the time, who then later became senator. And that Admiral Olson was involved in the Battle of Mogadishu, which was popularized by the very moving film Black Hawk Down. By working with a lot of military officers, I've noticed that the way they train their mind and body and the way they appreciate and manage risk has a lot to do with the way they look at making calculations at risk at these 3 levels: the personal, the professional, and more importantly, the national security level. So if we think about how to translate that to our own daily lives, how can we manage risk in a responsible fashion? And that's where I think it's important to think through, how do we even in our own kind of minute lives, have I backed up all my documents on my PC? I have a student who's an undergrad who will remain nameless, whose iPhone landed in a toilet at 1 a.m. in a bar in Georgetown, and she did not have any way to communicate, and more importantly, lost all that information because she hadn't backed it up. But if we think about more kind of catastrophic incidents, whether it's a terrorist attack or a natural disaster, have you thought about preparing yourself and your family and your home in terms of creating a plan? So I think you need to prioritize what risks you're exposed to, depending on where you live or what kind of lifestyle you actually lead, and think pretty carefully as to if you have a contingency plan or an idea as to how to go about that plan. And we actually use in the emergency preparedness arena this kind of flow chart where you're taking a look and figuring out whether you're running your business or your household or your community, ways to respond to catastrophic crises. And sadly, but actually not tragically, thankfully, in my own life, about 10 years ago, Christmas night, our family has a farmhouse in New Jersey. And we had just entertained about 50, 60 of our families and friends on Christmas Day. And at 2:30 in the morning, I heard a very loud crackling noise. And I went to figure out where it was. And it actually was the wall of our old colonial home, and it was on fire. But you couldn't see the flame and you couldn't see the smoke. And from my training in government, I actually felt the wall and realized that's what it was. It was 19 degrees that night. I have something called a go bag that had, at that time, my passport, keys to my car, cell phone, anything I needed to go with. Woke up my parents, and we actually left the house right before it really turned into an inferno. And thankfully, I'd taken the keys to the car, which was a heated car with heated seats. And that car actually saved us because it took a while for the first responders to come out at 19 degrees and, more importantly, put out the fire, which was about 3 hours. And because of the way we had planned, and more importantly, because my father and my mother are really serious about thinking about planning as survivors of World War II and the Japanese occupation, they were always worried about having a plan. And thankfully, that plan saved our lives. Unfortunately, we lost my journals, my diaries, my transcripts, all these things that were just, they didn't really have value compared to the lives that we actually were able to save on that night. So these are things that you need to kind of think about at the most basic level, is how we think about managing risk. And when I think about myself, it's pretty funny about, let's see, we had the blizzard of 2010 that incapacitated Washington, D.C. for over a week. And it was pretty ironic that the first responders who live very close to me were the ones who were unprepared. So I actually have in my house, yes, I have stacks of water. I live 10 blocks from the White House, as some of you know. I have stacks of water as tall as me. I have vital victuals, and I have batteries, flashlight, all the usual things that you would need in something for your emergency. But I also have Veuve Clicquot champagne and Godiva chocolates, just in case I need to shelter in place and duct tape myself in. But you would be amazed how many of my neighbors for this blizzard did not plan. And this was something we knew was coming as a front that was coming from west to east. And the way I look at it is, it was the most funny of all the anecdotes that we had was one of my colleagues whose husband is a gadget freak. He actually had bought a snowblower, but he was basically stranded because guess what he forgot to buy? Diesel fuel for the snowblower. It took them 4 days to get out of their house in suburban Virginia. So if I think about the way I've lived my life, which is pretty risky, and many of my friends say that I've used several of my 9 lives, I think we all have the inner courage and the resilience in order to go and use what I would call these 3 R's. Basically responding to risk with resourcefulness, because you will never know when you'll have to draw on that inner strength and that reserve in order to overcome any adversity. Thank you.